A millionaire stops at a small store and overhears two twins quietly asking to take bread on credit. He pays without a word, but something about their voices, their eyes, their silence follows him home. He starts returning, first with groceries, then with no reason at all. What begins as a simple act of help slowly pulls him out of his own empty world and into a life he never knew he needed. Follow us to see how it all unfolds. January 2023. Evening. The sky hung low over Marshwood, and though the snow hadn't yet fallen, the air was sharp and dry, biting against exposed skin. The corner of Douglas and Fifth held little activity this time of day, but the light in the window of the small grocery store cast a warm rectangle onto the cracked sidewalk. The store was old, with faded signage and a bell that jingled faintly when the door opened. Inside, the heat buzzed from overhead vents, and the air carried a mix of scents: slightly stale bread, cheap drip coffee from a machine near the back, and the subtle sweetness of synthetic candles stacked near the register. The store clerk sat behind the counter, flipping through the local paper with one elbow propped lazily on a stack of canned beans. His expression was neutral, glazed. He looked past the shelves but didn't really see anyone. At the front counter, two children stood side by side, a boy and a girl, both about 8 years old, bundled in oversized coats that had seen too many winters. Their cheeks were red from the cold, noses shiny from the dry wind, and their gloves were mismatched. The boy held a loaf of white bread against his chest, and the girl clutched a dented can of soup in both hands. They moved carefully, with a kind of practiced caution, as if they'd learned early that making too much noise brought the wrong kind of attention. Their voices barely carried across the small store, but their intent was clear. The clerk didn't look up. He shook his head once, slowly, and turned the page in his paper. Across the store, near the old soda machine humming quietly in the corner, stood a man, Walter Bryce. He was in his early 40s, dressed in a tailored wool coat, dark jeans, and polished boots that didn't belong on these floors. A pair of black leather gloves was crumpled in his left hand, the right casually tucked into his coat pocket. He hadn't planned to stop here. He was on his way home from a meeting across town, had taken a wrong turn, then spotted the light in the window. Something had pulled him in. He didn't move at first, just watched. Watched as the boy reached into his pocket, pulled out a few coins, counted them twice, and left them on the counter. Watched as the clerk pushed the items forward without a word, eyes still on the paper. Watched as the girl checked the can for dents one last time, then tucked it against her brother's arm. Together they turned and walked out, pushing the door open without looking back. Walter stepped forward. He reached the counter just as the bell above the door quieted again. The clerk looked up, surprised for the first time. Walter pulled a bill from his wallet, placed it silently on the counter, and gave a single nod. The clerk hesitated, then reached for the cash. Walter didn't wait. Outside, the wind had picked up. The children were halfway down the block, small shapes bundled in dull-colored coats, holding their groceries with both arms as if protecting something fragile. Walter stood there, watching them walk away. Something stirred in him, unfamiliar, uncomfortable. He turned, walked to his car parked along the curb, but once inside, didn't start the engine right away. That night, at home, the fire in his stone fireplace crackled softly. The television played a news segment about market trends, but the sound was muted in his mind. He sat back in his chair, still dressed, still holding his gloves. The image of the children walking down that cold sidewalk stayed with him. Not loud, not urgent, just quiet and heavy. He didn't sleep well. The following morning, Walter woke early. The sky outside his bedroom window was still dim, touched by the faintest suggestion of dawn. He didn't linger in bed. Instead, he dressed quickly, made his way downstairs, and poured a coffee from the machine near the kitchen window. It tasted bitter, mechanical, but he barely noticed. He stood there for a moment, mug in hand, staring out into the early silence. He left without telling anyone. The driver wasn't called. No meeting was scheduled. He drove himself into the older part of Marshwood, a part of town he had passed by for years but never really entered. The streets were narrower here, the sidewalks uneven, and the storefronts bore the weathered look of places that hadn't changed in decades. He parked near a laundromat and began walking. He didn't look out of place so much as unrooted. His coat was too fine, his shoes too polished for these blocks, but no one stopped him. The few people he encountered offered nods or avoided his gaze altogether. He asked questions, always with care, always brief, mostly about the children. Had they seen them? Did they live nearby? He spoke without urgency, without implication. Hours passed. His route meandered through side streets, past crumbling fences and satellite dishes tied down with wire. Finally, someone gave him a name for a street, then a house number. He followed it. The house stood quietly among others just like it, its porch sagging slightly toward the right. The paint was peeling in wide, dry curls. The steps creaked even in the breeze. Plastic covered the windows, fluttering faintly where the tape had given out. A broken bench leaned against the side of the porch, its slats cracked and darkened by years of weather. He didn't approach. Instead, he stood on the opposite side of the street, beneath a bare tree, and watched. After some time, the front door opened with a soft squeak. The girl from the store emerged, carrying a bag of trash. She moved quickly, as if used to finishing chores without delay. Soon after, the boy appeared, dragging a blue plastic bucket full of water. He struggled slightly, but made no sound. In the window, a woman stood. Her face was pale, drawn, and motionless. Her hands rested on the frame, her eyes distant and unfocused. She didn't blink, didn't react to the children. She simply stared out as if waiting for something that never came. Walter remained a few minutes longer, then turned and walked back the way he came. He didn't know why he had come at all. There had been no plan, no intention, only a weight in his chest and a question that wouldn't leave. Back at the office, everything was as it had always been. His assistant greeted him with updates. A thick folder of new contracts awaited on his desk, along with a list of appointments and legal calls from Billings. He nodded through them, made small notes, but his thoughts kept drifting. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the same things. The girl carrying trash, the boy lifting water, the woman frozen behind plastic windows. Later that afternoon, he asked his assistant for a favor. He kept it simple. No investigations, no surveillance. Just a name. The next day, she brought it to him in a sealed envelope. Jane Morris, 3 children. Husband deceased in an accident 3 years prior. Part-time position at the post office sorting mail. Monthly income well below state minimums. No extended family on record. Health insurance expired. Walter stared at the page for a long time. His hand remained on the envelope even after he had read the details. Then, without a word, he set aside the contract folder on his desk, pushed back his chair, and turned away from the windows. For the first time in years, he didn't reach for his phone. A few days after receiving the name, Walter returned to the quiet street where the house stood. The sky hung low, heavy with the threat of snow, and the bare trees whispered in the wind. He parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance. There was no one outside. The house looked unchanged, still slouched with tiredness, still silent. He placed the brown paper bag gently on the wooden steps. There was no note inside, no signature. He didn't want it to feel like charity. The contents were modest, but chosen with care. Canned vegetables, pasta, oatmeal, a bottle of vitamins, antiseptic cream, clean bandages, 2 pairs of thick wool socks, and a well-worn copy of a children's book, an old collection of fairy tales he had once liked himself. Then he turned and walked away. The next day, just after dawn, he returned. The bag was gone. The porch was empty. He left another one. This time it held similar essentials, plus a box of tea and a pair of gloves, small enough to fit a child. Again, he said nothing. Again, it disappeared by morning. He didn't wait for a thank you or acknowledgement. He wasn't doing it for that. It became a quiet rhythm. Every 2 or 3 days, a new paper bag. Sometimes food, sometimes simple necessities. Once a small flashlight, once watercolor paints and brushes still sealed in plastic. Each time the same silence, the same disappearance. He didn't mind. On a cold afternoon, he spotted the children in the park. They were seated on a bench feeding pigeons with pieces of stale bread. Their movements were slow and deliberate. They didn't speak. Their clothes hung loose, their cheeks raw from wind. He stayed on the opposite side of the path, pretending to read a newspaper, watching them from the corner of his eye. There was something about how they shared the bread equally, how they moved in harmony without instruction, that kept him standing there long after the pigeons had flown away. Later, he saw them again by the school fence. They were dragging a plastic bag full of empty bottles, the kind collected for a few cents each at the recycling depot. Their heads were down. He stayed in his car that time, parked across the street. He didn't want to interrupt them, didn't want to disturb the balance they had built to survive. He began visiting the neighborhood more often, not just to deliver supplies, but to observe quietly, without intrusion. He learned their patterns. Saw the boy rake leaves from a neighbor's yard. Saw the girl help an older woman cross the street with groceries. They were steady, invisible, unnoticed by most, but not by him. At work, the contrast sharpened. The sleek lines of his office felt increasingly foreign. The polished surfaces, the screens full of numbers, the echo of heels on tile. None of it felt connected to the life he now glimpsed just a few miles away. Meetings dragged, contracts blurred. He started finding excuses to leave early, to postpone calls. Without realizing it, he stopped wearing his suits. One day he reached for a tie and hesitated. Instead, he pulled on jeans, a heavy flannel shirt, and a worn jacket he hadn't worn in years. His assistant didn't comment. No one did. But the change settled into him like something long overdue. He kept returning to Douglas Street. He never knocked, never crossed the threshold. But he walked the sidewalk more slowly. Sometimes he stood under the same tree across the road, just to be near. He watched lights turn on and off, heard the distant hum of a washing machine. And he felt something shift, something quiet and real and entirely outside of himself. It was a late evening in February when the temperature in Marshwood dropped sharply. Wind swept through the streets, sending empty cans and torn flyers tumbling down gutters and against fences. The sky hung heavy, blanketed in clouds, and the street lamps flickered as if uncertain whether to hold back the dark. Inside the Morris house, the air felt thinner. The only light came from a dim bulb in the kitchen, casting a soft yellow glow that reached only partway into the living room. Jane lay on the old couch, barely conscious. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. Her skin looked pale beneath the shadows, and her lips had cracked from fever and dehydration. Emma, the oldest of the children, sat on the floor nearby, holding her mother's phone in both hands. Her thumbs hovered over the screen, uncertain, frozen not by cold but by hesitation. She scrolled through contacts, found none that felt right. No one they could ask. No one they trusted enough. The house was quiet, except for the occasional cough from the couch and the distant rattling of the wind against the windows. The twins, seated on the linoleum kitchen floor, sifted through a battered first aid box. They pulled out empty blister packs, a bottle of rubbing alcohol, and a roll of gauze that had long since lost its seal. No fever medicine, nothing that could help. Emma stood suddenly, remembering something. Days earlier, while unpacking one of the brown paper bags left anonymously on their steps, she had found an envelope tucked between a bag of rice and a pack of bandages. It wasn't addressed, but it had the logo of a hotel, Pine Ridge Inn, and a return address printed on the corner. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it. Now it was all she could think about. She didn't speak. She simply grabbed her coat from the peg near the door, shoved the envelope into her pocket, and stepped out into the cold. Her breath hit the air in short, cloudy bursts as she walked quickly toward the bus stop 3 blocks away. The ride felt endless, the windows fogged, the passengers silent. When the bus reached the center of town, she stepped off and ran the remaining distance to the hotel. The front desk receptionist saw her enter, windblown and panting. Recognition crossed her face. A call was made upstairs. Walter arrived less than 15 minutes later, still in the same clothes he had worn to a meeting that afternoon. When he heard what was happening, he made one call, to a physician he trusted, someone who owed him a favor and didn't ask questions. They drove to the Morris house together. Inside, Jane was slipping further away. Her temperature had soared. Her body was limp, her forehead burning. The doctor moved swiftly, checking vitals, administering fluids, issuing orders without raising his voice. Walter watched, absorbing everything. The children stood nearby, tense but silent, watching the adult world finally take notice. Once Jane was loaded into the back of the physician's vehicle, Walter stayed. He turned off the stove, which had been left on low. He poured warm water into mugs and handed one to each child. He retrieved a blanket from a hall closet and covered the twins. He knelt beside the youngest, brushing back damp hair from his forehead. These were small gestures, clumsy ones, but they came from instinct, not instruction. Later, he called the hotel and requested a room. Not one of the luxury suites, but a quiet, comfortable space with 3 beds, clean linens, and a working heater. The children followed him there without protest, They were too tired to question, too numb to resist. Inside the room, he turned on the light and let them explore. There were towels in the bathroom, hot water in the shower, and a small television mounted in the corner. A bedside lamp glowed gently, warm and reassuring. For the first time in many nights, they didn't curl up on the same couch. They chose separate beds, placed their shoes neatly at the sides, and lay down. Walter sat in the chair near the window and watched. The boy laughed quietly at something the girl whispered. The sound surprised him. It was light, real, not forced, not cautious. A sound he hadn't heard in their presence before. He didn't speak, just listened, then leaned his head back and closed his eyes. A week after her admission, Jane was discharged from the clinic. She moved carefully, her steps slower than usual, her frame still thin beneath the borrowed coat. Her face carried signs of the days she had spent unconscious, shadows under her eyes, a pale cast to her skin, but something had changed. Her gaze, though guarded, was no longer distant. It met the world directly, if cautiously. Walter waited outside in a modest sedan, the kind of car that drew no attention. When she appeared at the sliding glass doors with the twins beside her, he stepped forward without hesitation. He helped carry a paper bag of medications and the small duffel bag that held her clothes. No words passed between them. He simply drove them home. The house on Douglas Street looked the same as it had before, tired, sagging, the paint flaking in sheets from the siding. But Jane didn't pause on the porch. She unlocked the door with steady hands, let the children go in ahead of her, and held it open as Walter carried the bags inside. In the narrow hallway, he lingered for a moment. Then, without speaking, he took a business card from his wallet and placed it on the entryway table. He nodded once, then turned and left. 2 weeks passed. The weather warmed slightly, the snow along the sidewalks melting into slush. Jane's strength returned gradually. The children resumed school, returning each day with stories and homework and the smell of cafeteria food on their jackets. Jane kept the house clean, organized. She cooked simple meals, folded laundry, filled notebooks with grocery lists and unpaid bills. One afternoon, while the twins were at school and Emma was at the library, she stood alone in the kitchen. The card still sat on the table, curled at the corners. After a long pause, she picked it up and dialed the number. Walter answered. The conversation was brief. 2 days later, he returned, not with groceries this time, but with a laptop wrapped in a carrying case, a portable scanner, and a sealed envelope that contained a contract. The job was simple, sorting and verifying customer data for one of his company's online retailers. No commute, no face-to-face meetings, just quiet work done from home, on her own time. He walked her through the software, showed her how to log hours, how to track bonuses for accuracy. Everything was official. Everything had structure. Jane didn't ask why he had given her the opportunity. He didn't offer an explanation. There was no discussion of pity or past hardships, only the soft clicks of the keyboard as she tested her login credentials. The work suited her. It was orderly, consistent, manageable. Each morning she logged in, completed her assigned tasks, logged out. Her pay arrived at the end of each week, direct deposit, with a simple statement in her inbox. She spent none of it on herself at first. Groceries came first. Then new winter coats for the children, a backpack for Emma. Slowly the house began to look less temporary. Walter visited now and then, not with announcements or schedules. Sometimes he brought small things, a box of tools to fix a leaky pipe, a bag of books from a local donation drive, a lamp with a dimmer switch for the twins' room. Once, when the kitchen faucet sputtered and died, he spent an hour under the sink, sleeves rolled up, tools spread on a towel beside him. The children sat at the table doing homework while he worked. He never stayed long. He never came with expectations. Sometimes he just sat in the chair by the window, sipping the instant coffee Jane made without apology. He didn't speak much about his life outside. When asked, he would offer a vague gesture, a nod, a small shrug. The suits were gone. He dressed simply now, and his posture had lost its sharp edges. The children grew used to his presence. They no longer flinched when he arrived, no longer watched him with suspicion. He became part of the rhythm of their days, quiet, steady, unobtrusive. Jane never thanked him directly. Instead, she showed it in small ways. A clean porch, a cup of coffee already waiting, a fresh towel laid out if he was fixing something. Walter didn't try to define what it was he felt. He didn't need to. It was enough to know that when he showed up, he was no longer stepping into someone else's world. He was simply returning to a place where he was welcome. Spring came early to Marshwood that year. By late March, the snow had pulled back from the sidewalks, retreating into the corners of parking lots and the shaded edges of rooftops. Patches of grass re-emerged, flattened and pale but alive. Trees stood bare but expectant, and the air carried that faint, invisible promise of warmth. At the house on Douglas Street, the windows were open. A breeze moved through the rooms gently, lifting the thin curtains and stirring the scent of something cooking in the kitchen. Onions, garlic, a hint of tomato. Outside, the twins played on the front porch, tossing a tennis ball back and forth. Emma sat on the steps with a book in her lap, squinting at the page, sunlight slipping through the space between two loose boards in the railing. Walter stood at the edge of the property, just beyond the low wooden fence that marked the boundary. His hands were in his pockets. He didn't call out, he didn't move for a long time. He simply stood and watched the scene unfold in quiet rhythms. The sound of the ball hitting the porch, the clatter of pans from the kitchen, the occasional gust of wind rustling the leaves that had gathered against the house. Eventually, he reached for the gate latch and pushed it open. It creaked, but no one looked up in surprise. No one paused. The moment welcomed him without ceremony. He crossed the yard slowly. When he reached the porch, the children stepped aside to let him through. No words were exchanged. The front door was open. He walked inside. He wasn't a guest. Not anymore. Later that evening, Walter returned to his own home, the one with the large driveway and the perfect lawn, the stone fireplace, the glass staircase, the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was still immaculate, still silent. He walked through the rooms slowly, as if surveying a museum. His footsteps echoed faintly off hardwood floors. He passed the bookshelf in the hallway, stopped before the row of unused watches, each in its own display case. None had been worn in years. By the front door, on a brass hook, hung the pair of black leather gloves he had once worn on a cold night at the grocery store. The same gloves he had held when he first saw the twins at the counter. He looked at them for a moment, then reached up, took them down, and placed them carefully in a drawer by the stairs. The drawer closed with a quiet click. A month later, the house was empty. Walter had signed the paperwork and turned over the keys. He didn't look back. The new house he purchased sat just a few blocks away from the Morris family. It was smaller, with a sloped roof and a porch that needed painting. The floors creaked when walked on. The kitchen needed updating. But the windows let in light from the east in the mornings, and there was room enough for what he needed. He didn't move there to be closer in distance. He moved because it felt like a place where presence mattered. On one particular evening, he found himself once again at the Morris house. The door was ajar. From inside came the warm smell of dinner and the soft hum of a radio. Jane was setting the table, aligning forks and plates with care. The children helped, passing napkins, pouring water. Laughter drifted in from the hallway, light and unfiltered. Walter stepped inside, removed his jacket, and took a seat at the table. No one paused to acknowledge it. He belonged there now, not as a benefactor or a symbol of rescue, but as a person, someone who had earned his place through quiet persistence and presence. He didn't speak much during the meal. He didn't need to. The food was simple, the conversation scattered, but there was warmth in the way the children leaned toward each other, in the sound of Jane's voice as she asked who wanted more rice. There was a kind of fullness in the air. As the evening wore on, the light outside dimmed. Walter looked around the table, at the chipped plates, the scratched surface of the wooden chairs, the shoes piled by the door, and he felt something settle in his chest. Not joy, not triumph, but something quieter, steadier. He understood now. A house could be beautiful. It could be full of expensive things, art and order. But it wasn't a home, not by itself. A home was built from being needed, from being seen, from being welcome. He had found that. And it was enough.